where we are in the world. And I want to invite you to join me for just a second before we start by just stopping and acknowledging all of the struggle and pain and difficulty that is in the world in this moment. And just sitting with that for a moment, breathing with it without pushing it away nor bringing it any closer, but being aware. I also want to invite you now to bring your attention to all of the incredible beauty that's also happening in this very moment. The kindness, the tenderness, the effort to be protective of one another. The beauty of the place that we call home, wherever it may be. And sit with that for a minute. Let that permeate. And finally, I want to invite you to turn your attention inward once more and to your own desires and hopes and aspirations to be helpful in this moment, to find a way to be of real service and benefit. And just breathe with that for a minute. Thank you. I have to tell you, it's I don't even have the proper adjective for what it is to do what we're doing together in this moment. I have had the privilege of working on food systems for over 20 years and never have all of the underlying systems that we depend upon been laid more bare. Never have the obvious inequities and suffering that we experience day in and day out been made more clear and obvious. And I think never have we ever been asked to reach more deeply inside of ourselves and into our communities and to those that we feel accountable to do our best work ever. When I think about COVID and I think about the this hidden spread of a disease that is deadly at times and not at others, I still come back to people that we love, whether they're farmers, whether they're our neighbors, whether they are our people we've never met but feel connection to. It's a moment where things that we know are true are being brought back in front of our consciousness in a way that we cannot forget. That our brothers and sisters of color, particularly our brothers and sisters from the African American community, are experiencing higher than expected, or higher than, I'm not sure expected is the proper term, higher mortality rates from this disease, is something that we could have predicted. And if we thought back on it and looked at the underlying systems that create the conditions that result in the deaths of our brothers and sisters, we can understand. And that's a lot of what today is about, is using the tools of systems leadership and systems thinking as a way to make more sense of a moment when making sense is critically important. So I'm going to ask your patience with me, your compassion with me as we try to work our way through providing you a set of tools that I think will be helpful. And to use these tools, I just want to encourage you to acknowledge that we are living in a moment that's at the knife edge between hope and fear. Will everything collapse? Will everything get better? And I want to bring ourselves back to this very moment, because systems leadership and systems thinking is about being very clear about what's happening now so that we can act for the greatest benefit. I also want to let you know that when we talk about leadership, sometimes we think about transcendental leaders, or we think about people that we really respect. That's great. But the utter reality is that everything that you have been doing in your lives to this moment, every experience that you have, every story you have been read to, and every story you've read to someone else, everything has prepared you for this moment. And even though we may feel inadequate to it, if we can reach down into our deepest capacities, and not just our own personal capacities, but the capacities of those around us, our communities, our loved ones, our elders, our youngers, we can and will make this a moment of not just crisis, but transformation. And that is the essence of systems leadership. It's the small thing that you can do and that I can do. So what is this term? Could I have the next slide, please? Who are systems leaders? What are they about? And you know, I've taught a lot about leadership, and you know, put slides here of you know, people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi and others. And yet I put a picture up here of a woman that I bet many of you don't know. Her name's Millie Torvido-Sacida, and she is the leader and one of the founders of the farm worker women's movement. And this person, working in a quiet way in a tucked away corner in California, has changed the way that women as farm workers have begun to organize and act and seek justice for their world. She is a systems leader because her commitment to service creates that same commitment in others. It's a beautiful leadership trait, that she has this unique ability to see all of the perspectives and enable others to do so as well, while not losing the deep truth of her own experience. That I found Millie and all systems leaders to be people who are incredible in their capacity for listening. Now I want you to stop and think about it. Think about the people who've really touched you. How many of them were really good listeners? My guess is quite a few. Even your friends, the ones that you hold closest and dearest, the ones that really are there for you, they're probably marked by this skill. They experiment. Millie kept trying different ways to organize, how to work together, what works, how aggressive in activism, how aggressive in organizing. And it's a constant ferment. So systems leaders and leaders as a whole are not locked into their own idea of what the solution is. They're locked into the idea of trying everything and finding what works. There's one more click here. And I think this last one is really incredibly important. Their compassion, forgiveness, and love evoke a desire for justice and peace. I have never seen a person more dedicated to justice and peace, but also more compassionate about the struggle of the farm worker women, the struggle of our farming system, and through this single-minded sense of love, compassion, and a desire for justice have actually changed conditions for farm workers in California, and now she's working nationally. Systems leadership is a term that we're seeing more and more in the world. And I want to break it down to its simplest parts. There's really only three things that we as systems leaders need to focus on and need to sharpen our blades around. The first is we need the ability to see the whole. And by seeing the whole, I mean all the parts, all the little pieces that are operating. So many of us tend to see things through our single lens, right? We work in a food hub, or we work in a very focused place. And we should do that because that's what we're called to do. But as systems leader, we want to put that into the bigger picture and connect it to all the other systems. So today we're going to talk a little bit about tools that help us see the whole. The second thing that Millie was so amazing at, and I believe that each of you can be amazing at if you're not already, is the ability to encourage others to reflect and be in dialogue. Because the reality that we want to create, the better world that we're working towards, the justice that we want to evoke, it is co-created. It isn't a single person standing in front. It's the amazing conversation in community, in organization that enables us to really dig deep and find what's deeply true. Reflection, to ask ourselves the harder questions. Is it working? What happened? How did it come together? So our ability as facilitators of deep conversation, one of the hallmarks. And the third, I think, is perhaps the most important. It's the ability to lead from the emerging future. In every moment, there is a future that is trying to be born into the day. We can see today several different paths of what could happen out of COVID. We could return to a normal that didn't work for most of the people that we care about. But there is a new normal, a new better that's also emergent and possible in this moment. And if we can turn our skills to being the enablers of that new moment to come forward and become real, we can shift the course of history. This, however, is very different than typical problem solving. If I do typical problem solving, I'm going to accept the system at the level it was given. And all of you have heard that same Einstein quote that says you'll never solve the problem at the same level at which it was created. In fact, we have to step outside of it because some of the deep inequities and injustices that we're concerned with are so rooted in the way things are, in the problem structure, that we have to completely redesign them. So these three skills are the three skills of systems leadership that we really want to focus on. And over the course of our three meetings together, we'll look at we'll look at one little piece of each one. Now, this is a sampler. This is a little bit like a box of candies, stealing something from Forrest Gump, that we're going to taste something from. Systems leadership is a lot of capacities and a lot of skills, but today I want to offer one of them in particular, and I want to talk a little bit about seeing systems. So many of you have probably seen this Iceberg model that says that a lot of what matters out there in the world isn't immediately visible. And that's a great lesson. Just give me a wave. How many of you have seen this, seen or used the Iceberg model? I'm just going to quickly see and go around, look around. Excellent, excellent. I want to use it in a little different way today, because typically the way the iceberg is used is this idea that we start at the top and we work our way down. But I want to suggest that it's a diagnostic tool that can be used really flexibly to work from any direction. And it helps us organize the way that we think about things. But just as a quick reminder, first about systems and then about the Iceberg model, that systems are all around us. That this iceberg could be used to describe things that are very simple or very complex. If we think about a clock, we just expect that it works. It's not until we open it up and we see its mechanisms that we begin to see its structure. If we think about food systems as this gigantic system, it's almost unbearably complex and we can't possibly think about it or break it down in its meaningful parts. But if we start to think about the system that is that we touch day in and day out, the system that gets food from the farm to the farmer's market, we can begin to see things. If we talk about the system that gets food that's not harvested from the farm to places where it's needed through gleaning or whatever way, you can see another element of a system. Systems have an interesting property, and something that we as systems leaders have to pay attention to, that they tend to do what they were designed to do. So right now, the system for delivering healthcare in America is designed to serve an expected number of sick allocated largely according to wealth and prosperity, with some safety nets. And it within the parameters it was designed to do, it will work. But if you break the parameters, it doesn't break. There are other systems that are absolutely designed to keep our brothers and sisters from experiencing prosperity, systems that systematically drain resources from communities. The thing that's important for us as systems thinkers to understand is that it's not that systems are broken, it's that they're working too well, particularly ones that take away from the objectives that we are working towards. In order to change and replace a system, we've got to understand it and we have to be able to see it. And so that's really what this is about. So one of the liberating concepts I really want to emphasize today is that it's not usually helpful to think about the giant system, like healthcare writ large. It's almost always better to think about it in your own location, in the smallest possible vein. Why? Because those are the places that we as systems leaders have the most leverage on. And we look for additive effects as we modify these systems one spot at a time. That's what the core of the local food or good food movement has been trying to do for years, is trying to build up lots of small systems changes and have it add up together. You do not have to be an expert at every corner of a system to be able to be a systems leader and around the part of the system that you are knowledgeable of and you can influence. And it's the same thing for communities. They don't have to have control of the whole. They can take care of the thing that's right in front of them. And so we are all powerful around the systems that we can be close to. So what about this iceberg and how does it fit into this? If we think about systems that are in front of us right now, what are some of the systems that are really failing us? So let's think about availability of toilet paper. And I'm going to use this in grave seriousness. So you go into almost any market today and there's a lack. There, you may not be able to get it. It may be exorbitantly priced. Why? Because at the systems level, that system was designed to deliver a set quantity of toilet paper at a predictable rate all year round because there weren't big peaks and valleys in demand. And when there was a shock to that system, it wasn't able to respond. And so then what did you see? Well, you saw fear, a pattern of fear out in the world. And that fear resulted in events, people going to stores and buying lots of toilet paper and taking it home. So there's a lot going on there, but what we can see underneath it is a system that got pressed in a way that doesn't let it work well. And in that, we can see it replicated so many different ways. We talked a little bit about the system of healthcare delivery, particularly in African-American communities, where right from the beginning, the root systems there that promote health, whether they were access to healthy food, access to groceries, access to the income to buy that food, access to jobs that enable mental health and good opportunities. These all feed into weaker systems for healthcare, which show up in patterns that are of diabetes or obesity or hypertension, that show up as risk factors for COVID, and then show up as events of the death of our brothers and sisters. So these systems are tragic in their outcomes if they're not designed to serve the benefit and the common good. In many cases, they're not. They were designed to allocate scarce resources. So when we look at this model, it's important to recognize that we act and need to act at all different levels of systems, all different ways that we see things. Many of you are probably concentrating and acting on the events that you're seeing. Why? Because you need to, because people are suffering right now. We had to right away redesign school food so that kids didn't go hungry today. So that is absolutely an immediate reaction to an event that we see. But now we're beginning to ask ourselves the question, can we anticipate and plan and prepare for what's coming? So what happens to our farming systems and our food access systems if we have shelter in place that lasts as long as June or lasts all year? What happens? So that's the level of imagining what's the pattern that's going to play out here. And then finally, when we get down to the bottom of this, we begin to see the system that we have. We're very dependent on the systems as they exist to work, and many of them are breaking. But as they break, they give us the opportunity to rethink about how they operate. So I'll give you an example, another one at this base level. So much of America's food supply, and particularly for specialty growers, was designed and grown for restaurants. And now restaurant demand is cratering. So that food, I know many of you are working to redesign the system so that that food can flow to the people who need it, so that it can be consumed at home and not at restaurants. That system redesign can be done in a way that's pro-equity and pro-environment. It's a huge opportunity for us to re-architect what's going on. A tool like this becomes useful for us because it helps to sort out what we're reacting to and what we're thinking about. And as systems leaders, that's part of this effort to see the whole. Let me just check on our time. We're doing really good. So what I'd like to do is, it's easy to talk about a thing like this, and what I really want to do is have you play with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to break into some small groups, and I want to have you take advantage of this diagnostic tool to understand what's happening in food systems with COVID. And all I want to do is invite you to get into sort of a group brainstorm. And specifically, I'd like you to look at this one question in your communities. What are the systems down at the very bottom of this iceberg? What are the systems that are failing or breaking? And if you have time, I like also to look at, what are some of the other things that are going on? What are the patterns you're seeing or the events? But think about first at that systems level. You also may find that systems are working. There are things that are definitely going well. And I'd like you to take a peek at some of those. All of the data that you collect here is good. We'll be joined, the folks that are here, myself and our friends from the Wallace Center will all host these breakouts. And we'll just try to do our best to capture what goes on here. But I do want us to encourage to begin to look at those systems and name them for what they are. And here are just two more hints. Be descriptive. Try to name the system not as a big thing, but as a little thing. This is the system that got food from John's farm to the farmer's market, and here's where it's falling apart because, that kind of thing. And be kind. Like, there are lots of different kinds of systems that are in play here, and all of us will see systems in a different way. Sound like a good way to dig in here? Yeah, a couple of thumbs up there will be good. Just say wave at me. Thank you. I think with that, we'll get it set up to do breakouts. Annalena, are we ready?
Yeah, I think we are. Everyone should be able to enter a room. And for those of you on the phone, you'll also should be able to be placed into one of the breakout rooms. So I will open these up now. And you should have an option to join a room. And hopefully that works for everyone. Let's see, looks like a few people are still hanging out. All right, so for those of you guys.
systems diagnostic tool. And what questions do you have about how you might use this, and how it could be a benefit in the work that we're collectively doing?
Feel free to use the chat box too if you don't want to unmute.
Now, don't be shy. I know we had this, somebody's always got to be the one that's got to be the first here. So even just share one thing that you noticed from your conversation with the group, it'd be great.
Hi, this is Cheryl again. I just wanted to say that what I noticed was there were a lot, I know for me, I was nodding my head as other people were going through their observations with systems that were broken down, whether, it's healthcare, the lack of volunteers, and other things that affect the food system. I think it was, we're feeling feeling similar pains across the country and around the world. So it was great to be able to kind of vent and problem solve together as a team.
Thank you. Beautiful. How about someone else? A couple more sort of observations.
We have Terry in the chat box just shared that the lack of internet service, especially in rural areas, and the resulting challenges.
So
I see a bunch of heads nodding to that one.
you're nodding. Terry, are you able to unmute? Because I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about how that is affecting, how COVID makes this more poignant.
Well, because it was, I guess because it was so quick, the quickness of it, and at least here I'm in North Idaho, and we're just beginning to be able to get out into the fields to, farmers are. I mean, it snowed here last week. So we have a really short growing season. I think people were, as soon as this season hits, they have to get outside. And so having to pivot and figure out new ways to distribute their food. And still big questions coming up about the farmers markets and how can they respond to that? Can they even have a market? All of those things that just make it extremely difficult to do when nature moves on and they don't have time to sit around and think about it. They have to get seeds in the ground and so forth.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Terry. Robbie, maybe you could talk a little bit about the situation in Alaska and how transportation in rural areas is affecting our COVID response, and is a system that maybe is breaking down a little bit.
Yeah, I shared this with our group, but for the whole group, most of our food system is tied into the lower 48. So we bring in over 95% of our food, and as soon as the port of Seattle breaks down, the entire state gets screwed up. So the other issues going on in Alaska, a lot of our remote areas are serviced by ferries or regional airlines, and our big regional airline just declared bankruptcy. So all of the Alaska Native villages and other rural areas that depend on that with no road system are now scrambling for solutions. And then this past year, our governor drastically cut funding to our Alaska Marine Highway. That's our ferry system. So even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we were having food security issues in those communities that depended on the ferries for supplying their food.
Yeah, so it's so interesting. It's a really important point. I think across the board, the systems that are more concentrated, have single points of failure in them, like yours, like the Port of Seattle breaks down, then the whole food system breaks down. Rural communities where there may only be one or two trucks that come in, those where there's single points of failure, those systems aren't resilient, and therefore they tend to break. And so these are great things for us to pay attention to as systems designers. And the beauty of Alaska is its incredible expanse. The difficulty of Alaska is its incredible expanse. And so we have to be really smart about that. I'm curious, because I didn't ask this, but I'm wondering if one of you is experiencing a system that's really working in your community, because it also helps tell us something about systems.
I think
I
I
did.
think the farmers. I'm sorry. I'll wait for the next person because I already
Thank you.
spoke.
Thank you, Cheryl.
This is Helen Dumbalis with the National Farm to School Network. And actually what I was going to say relates to that question about where systems are working. What I really liked about the breakout group and what you said earlier, Joseph, is that like we're each working on systems within the broader food system and we don't have to be responsible for all of them. So I work in the school food world, but it was helpful to hear in our breakout group and also just in our recent experiences, see how even though school food systems have been breaking down in a lot of ways, there are market opportunities for farmers elsewhere, you know, such as a lot with direct to consumer. So it's just been neat to see how a breakdown in one part of the food system has led to opportunity in other parts of the system.
Yeah, that's the beauty. And that also is a hint of like what resilience is when we can pivot and move. So helpful. Hey, Annalena, there are a number of folks who have got their hands up and you've got a little bit of control about putting hands down. We've heard from Helen. How about Jay? You had something you wanted to share.
Yep, this is Jay from South Central Pennsylvania. I guess there's two things. I think, I don't want to be quick. There's a phrase that a crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste.
Right.
And I really appreciated Susan kind of directing our group because there is a lot of grief right now about systems that are failing and people that are in survival mode and people that have perspective on systems but are trying to hold failing systems together on a shoestring.
Yeah.
So a question I have is how to kind of pivot from that. How do you get beyond survival mode?
Yes.
When you don't have the resources to try to get to a point mentally or mentally to be able to convey that this is actually an opportunity.
Yeah. Hey, let's stop for a second right here because Jay, you point to something that's so critical. In the middle of the crisis, there's always a green shoot that's growing. Look around your experience. What do you see? Where is that? Is it in the kind of redirection of resources that Helen just talked about? Is it in the situation that Robbie talked about maybe we have to have a different kind of ownership of transportation in Alaska so that we can guarantee that there's always transportation. You know, where is that green shoot? And how do we as systems leaders do two things? Cultivate our ability to see it and cultivate our capacity to nurture it. And that's a lot of what we're going to continue to talk about in our next two sessions, Jay. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Monique, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, very similar to what you and Jay both just mentioned. An observation I had in our group was that many of these systems failures are taking place because of underlying assumptions that went into building these systems.
Yes.
And when we step forward to brainstorming new answers and new solutions, how are we going to account for old assumptions that didn't work,
Yes.
new assumptions that we need to have but we're not aware of yet, and the fear that's going to go into kind of guiding those assumptions, and how we kind of move beyond that to get to that creative place that you're talking about.
Oh, Monique, what a beautiful question. Can I get you all to stick around for the next 24 hours and we can work on that one? Can you give me an example of one of those assumptions that you think that is sort of being thrown up for us to look at again?
Well, I'll use the example that I shared in my group, specifically around congregate meal sites. And how the prohibition of congregate meal sites is impacting many food insecure individuals in my community.
Yeah. So it challenged our very notion of how do we put together. There's a mental model of efficiency that's underneath that as well that we have to play with. That's a great question. And I can't promise you that we'll have a full answer, but it's something that we're definitely going to continue to look at over the next two times we get together. Marty, you had put your hand up. I'd love to hear what you had to share.
Mine is kind of a question, more a
Sure.
question about systems thinking. You talk about the importance of seeing the whole system, and then you also made a comment about focusing in on small systems that we can really know and
influence.
influence. And in our group, we heard about so many systems that are having issues, you know, healthcare system, food distribution system, farming, etc. And so my question is mostly about levels to focus on. That's what's going on in my head right now. It's like, how do I focus my attention on the system and at what level?
Yeah, that's a beautiful
am I
question.
looking at the food system as a whole, or am I looking at my little part, which is also like Helen Morris?
Yeah. Marty, you're breaking up a little bit, but I can't answer that question for you, because the essence of being a food systems leader is to understand what it is that it's yours to do, and to do it with great heart and great intention. And that process of discerning that, like, where is Marty's role, and where is Margot's role, and Nick's role, and all of that, you have to do that work yourself. But what I would tell you is that it helps to have the ability to hold dual mind. Like, I work on what's right in front of me, but I'm paying attention to the big systems trends, and I can see the linkage so that I can get in alignment when I am needed to be part of moving the whole. And I can also pull the whole into my narrower problem so that they can see what is really happening. So it's kind of like holding the duality of it. Now, friends, we're almost out of time. And I want to say again how grateful I am that you took the time to be with us. Do take a look at the chat that's there. There's some wonderful comments here that we haven't been able to address. In the next 2 meetings, we're going to be looking at the other circles. So if today was about looking at the system, we're also going to look about encouraging reflection and dialogue in the COVID moment, and what does that look like? So the whole question of public participation and engagement when we can't be with each other will be part of that. And then the last one is, how do we begin to cultivate and pay attention to those green shoots and serve and solve for the emerging future? I think you'll find them to be, I hope you find them to be of benefit. And I'm just so grateful you took time today. Annalena?
Awesome. Thank you, Joseph. And thank you everyone for joining and contributing to the group breakout and the smaller group breakouts. We'll follow up with this recording and a survey. Would love to hear your feedback on how this experience was for you guys, so that we can adapt the future sessions to work out best. I am also putting that link to the survey in the chat box in case you can get to it now. And other than that, have a really beautiful rest of your day, and thank you for joining us. So.